Let's get started. So, monthly space news. As of August 13th, 2022, we do these once a month to go along with our meetings. And of course, it's a space society, so you have to start off with the James Webb Space Telescope. You just can't avoid it. It's everywhere. By now, I'm sure all of you have seen all of these pictures a million times, but needless to say, they've been spectacular. Everybody's enjoyed them, looking farther and back in time and in distance into space. People have done comparisons on some of the same things that have been looked at. So, for instance, the lower left corner, there was something from the what the Webb telescope was looking at. Hubble had a similar picture, and basically because it's deeper infrared, you can see a lot more detail. You can see through dust that you couldn't see otherwise. That actually is kind of the main feature of it. The big thing is by shifting to deeper and deeper into infrared, you can see further and further into the past, because the further and faster things are going away from you, the more redshift you get. So all that visible light that was there once is now shifted down into the infrared. So anyway, I think we've probably all seen all these nice pictures. So I'll skip right over those and get on to the moon. And of course, we already got a little intro from Nathan here on Artemis. I'll talk about a couple of things. One that people don't hear as much about is the commercial lunar payload services, which is in fact a part of Artemis. Everybody thinks it's only just the manned space program, but actually all that is included as well. And there's a new mission, there's some old missions that have been delayed, and a bankruptcy, but we'll get to those. Some of these launches, they've been delayed, but they're still starting. And December 2022, we'll see the first two. Now, usually when things are scheduled for December 22nd, 2022, you know those are actually going to be delayed. That's an aspiration, and maybe some of them won't go off on time. And of course, as you already heard, Artemis 1, which is the big SLS rocket launch, that is scheduled for August 29th. So here's some things about the CLPS program. It stands for Commercial Lunar Payload Services. And it's set up kind of modeled somewhat like the commercial crew and the commercial cargo services, where the idea is NASA contracts for services, like delivery services, basically DHL. And they started that mold with cargo and then with crew. The idea is you build up a couple of competitors. The idea is hopefully at least two. So they tried that first with cargo and then with crew. And so we ended up with SpaceX and Boeing, which still hasn't quite gotten there yet, but maybe maybe this year, maybe not, but they'll be there eventually. Key thing is buying delivery services. You really are running a DHL or a FedEx or something, as opposed to buying a bunch of spacecraft. And the idea is that therefore all these companies that are doing this, they can go off and do other things. They can sell services. Now, the reality is, of course, an awful lot of the demand is still driven in directly or indirectly by government, but at least it is a start so that you hope that a commercial economy builds up. And that's the idea behind it. The way these things are structured is basically it's really literally delivering a payload to the surface of the moon. And that means, in theory, NASA doesn't worry about how it gets there. It doesn't worry about the rocket, who launches it. It doesn't worry about the lander, how it gets down there. It just basically shows up. And it also takes care of all of the things like integrating the payload with whatever rocket you're using. And all those things are kind of a big deal that take time. But the main thing is you're offloading those details pretty much just to the companies that are bidding on their services. The intention here was small scale projects, not the massive kind of things, but the small things like delivering a small load, maybe a refrigerator sized object in service of Mars, or maybe one more like a shoebox size. That kind of thing. As a result, they could tolerate a much higher level of risk. And that's the key thing, kind of almost like a DARPA kind of a thing, where you figure, okay, maybe you don't have quite as many safety checks, maybe you run things a little faster. And that's a trade-off, is that you realize not everything's going to make it to the moon in this case. But if even half of them make it there, you've accomplished a lot. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper than following normal processes where it would take 10 years to get anything done. So that's the idea behind it. Again, think it's kind of like almost like a DARPA kind of a model. So who are some of the contractors? They first set this up several years ago, and fairly early on, they got a couple companies, Astrobotic, and we had a speaker from Astrobotic here a year and a half ago or so, sometime they're out of Pittsburgh. Intuitive Machines out of Houston, Maston Space, which I think is in California, Firefly, and others. And so, for instance, in the lander case, there are three of them here. Lower left, you have on one of Astrobotic's landers, they have two different ones. This is a smaller one called Peregrine. Intuitive Machines has one. And there was another outfit called Orbit Beyond, and they since have actually withdrawn from this business. But that was what they started with. Now, there have been some additions, and in July, they added one new one that hadn't been there. They're going to deliver scientific instruments to the far side of the moon. Now, it's not very far. It's near the South Pole, but still, at least it's on the other side. At least we look a little bit better compared to the Chinese that way. They're getting awarded $73 million. This is a pretty inexpensive mission as far as, big space missions go. There's a place called the Schrodinger Basin. It's about a 200-mile wide crater, and they're aiming for that one. But it's near the lunar South Pole. And along the way, so that they can actually communicate with the lander, they have to deploy a couple of small satellites, which are used as communication relays. Several of these missions actually have to include that for the same reason. And that makes this the 8th delivery contract that's been done. There aren't 8 companies, but some of them, like Astrobotics, have several of these contracts. And these are always just teams. They're not really just a single company. So, for instance, in the case of Draper, no, they're people. They're an MIT spinoff. I think they actually spun off probably a little after the Vietnam War era, when there was a lot of anti-war feeling, and they were doing a lot of military research. So they basically just split off. But essentially, it's an MIT spinoff. They've been there forever. They always did a lot of work in radar and that sort of thing. And so they've been doing this. General Atomics is a general contractor that does not just atomic stuff, but they're providing sensors, actually, in the case of this. iSpace is a Japanese company, which actually I think is providing the guts of the lander itself. Karman Space, and I don't even know what they do. Now, the launch provider isn't specified. This shows you an example of, nobody was worried about that. Well, they're worried about it, but NASA, in theory, doesn't have to worry about it. Now, in reality, they're going to have reviews, and, if they see a major problem, of course, they're going to raise their hand and say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Now, one of the larger ones got delayed for a year. This is the Viper Lunar Rover. And what that one is they're looking for water ice. Think of it as a prospector, basically a robotic prospector. And, the location of water on the moon is pretty important, because you want to do anything in situ, that is, using the resources of the land to generate breathable air, to get water for drinking, or to create rocket fuel, you need water. And so where is that water? That is one of the most precious things you can get, actually, on the moon, especially in the early stages. So they're prospecting. It'll run about 100 days. It's the size of a golf cart. It's the upper right corner here of the images. It's that one up there. It's a little dark and hard to see, but it has lights, because it's going to be exploring dark areas, which is where all of the water is going to be. It'll be in craters for the most part. And this is a pretty big object, as I said, golf cart size. It has a 1-meter drill, so it's going to be drilling in relatively far. We didn't manage to get that far on Mars. So I guess they probably beefed it up a little bit. And that's got to be a tricky thing, because with not much gravity, you start pushing down with a drill, you're just going to push yourself up. So they have to work on this very carefully. The rover itself, again, that's the payload. So that's built and managed by NASA, and NASA Ames specifically. Although a lot of the design work is, in fact, done at the Johnson Space Center. Estimate of cost of that payload is about $433 million. So, it's still relatively small scale, again, compared to the big, massive, multi-billion-dollar projects that we'll also see. Now, the lander itself is from Astrobotics, and that's called the Griffin lunar lander. It's bigger than that other one I showed you. And it's kind of been customized really pretty much for this mission. So right now it's kind of a one-off, but the idea is the guts of it could be reused with other things. The lower right corner is a picture of the Griffin lander along with the Viper on top of it. So what you're seeing here is, solar cells and stuff on the bottom, obviously the legs for landing. This stuff here, this is a little bridge so that the Viper, which is up on top of the thing, can roll down. So it'll roll down onto the surface. I don't know why they have landing going off either direction, but in any case, it's fairly elaborate mechanically. This is, I guess, in some ways like the way the Chinese lander and rover worked on Mars. Same kind of a deal. The rover was mounted on top of the lander, and then it extended a little bridge like that and then rolled down. So that one is Peregrine. And the thing about it, a lot of the subsystems, all of the control, mechanical stuff is all pretty much the same as what's in the Peregrine lander. So there's a lot of overlap there. And so in a way, you're going to get some testing done at the end of the year, this year. It's supposed to go up with the first of the United Launch Alliance Vulcan rockets. So whenever that happens, that remains to be seen. But, at least they're scheduled. They're actually the first payload for this. For this one, though, they're delaying the whole thing a year. Now, why are they delaying it? NASA basically wants more testing. I guess they're getting nervous. And I think to some extent, I might reflect that they're getting nervous that they don't want to have too many failures. So they're worried about that. Now, they did increase the contract. So this sort of defeats the idea a little bit that, well, these are supposed to be high-risk missions, and you just sort of put them out there and you don't issue a million change orders, which tends to slow down projects, which is what usually happens in the NASA project. But they did increase the funding to at least account for the fact that it will indeed, cost time and money. The thing about this now, the total mission, then you're talking about $700 some million, is getting pretty expensive. And it kind of questions, you're kind of on the edge of what really ought to be considered a high-risk mission. You're almost turning it into a normal mission. There's been some complaints about that, because one thing about this program, in a way, NASA is getting to do a lot of stuff that would be hard to do, but it might be hard to convince Congress to do this if it gets to be very expensive. And so in some ways, it's almost a stealth program. And they liked it that way. But now it's kind of creeping up. And if we're not careful, all of a sudden people might say, well, wait a minute, we Congress, we didn't authorize a lunar lander. What is all this? So there is a risk in all this anyway. And there has been concern about that at the time. Okay, the previous delays I'd mentioned, Intuitive Machines, they were supposed to go in 2021, and now that's December 22. It's hard to tell whether it's their fault or Falcon 9. I think they had some kind of a problem. Probably it was the payload, but you don't really know. Astrobotics, same kind of thing. There's a delay there. Now that one's kind of convenient because there's delays. Astrobotic was behind on this, but actually, of course, the Vulcan rocket is behind, as it has been for a long time. So that worked out pretty conveniently for everybody. They could sort of point fingers at each other, and everybody was happy. That Orbit Beyond company, they pulled off. They are still eligible for doing these kinds of projects, but they realized they couldn't do it in the time and money specified that they originally thought they could. So they dropped out. Now, Masten Space Systems, they are another one. They had a lander. That's the one on the far right over here. That got delayed also from 2022 to 2023. But actually, Masten just declared bankruptcy. So that one's not going to happen anyway. A little bit about that. They filed for Chapter 11. That implies that they're going to try to sell off their assets, but nobody really believes they're going to be able to survive. Normally what happens, you go into that, you sell off your assets, you satisfy your creditors, and you have some kind of a reduced size company that still survives. Nobody really believes that's going to happen, but they have that opportunity anyway. Originally, their contract was $76 million. Typically, 70 to 90 million was kind of the size of these projects. An asset they have is, I guess they must have already paid SpaceX something. That's considered an asset of theirs. They paid $4.6 million to SpaceX to get them there. And probably Intuitive Machines will get that. They had some kind of agreement with them. That was very unclear what it meant, but there was some kind of agreement that ultimately Intuitive Machines would have first crack at getting that slot. So they took it. Now, Masten was kind of interesting because besides this lander, they had other things going on. For instance, creating their own landing pad as they landed. And there have been several companies that talked about this, but there is a problem on the moon. There's a huge amount of dust that gets thrown up because there's a lot of dust sitting around anytime you land. And so what they were suggesting is they would throw in some material, maybe mostly a ceramic of some sort of melt it, and then it would vaporize, but then it would immediately coalesce into something kind of solid. And they would basically, as they descended, by having that extra material in there, they kind of create their own landing pad and cut down on the dust. That was the theory. Now, they hadn't really taken it that far. They pretty much just proposed it, but at least, they were kind of going down that path. I think that was one of their problems. They tried to do too many things at once. And that was just an example of it. They also had some other landers that, in fact, NASA had paid for and gotten good use out of, including some analysis for the Mars, various kinds of Mars landings. They used some of this company's equipment for doing that. They also had proposed mining water from the surface of the moon using a rocket engine, which actually isn't as completely crazy as it sounds. People have done the same kind of thing for petroleum reserves to some extent, as in a one way of doing it. You basically inject a whole lot of heat in the ground one way or another and get stuff to boil up and condense it. And they were going to propose to do the same kind of thing with a rocket engine. I mean, what's a great source of heat? Now, how you keep the thing in place while you're using a rocket engine, I don't know. But anyway, this is another one where they had the idea, they talked about it, and I don't think they'd actually put that much into it. But as an example, probably their own mismanagement had a lot to do with this failure. It's really hard to say. Okay, now we're up to Artemis 1. Nathan's already talked about this in a little bit. I'll go through a little bit of what some of the pieces of this thing are. First of all, the Orion capsule. That's where ultimately people will sit. In this case, it's just mannequins, no people. Behind that is what's called the service module that comes from the European Space Agency. And that actually has almost everything you need for life support, for propulsion, and so on. Now, additionally, for part of the mission, there's also a separate propulsion stage, which is basically a small rocket that gets detached in the process of getting there. That's your payload, if you will. But if you look over here at the full rocket as it takes off, there's some other stuff. Way on the very top here, you have a thing called the launch abort system. And that's so that if in the early stages of takeoff, something goes wrong, you can get some propulsion. It pulls it up basically and helps drop it off one way or another. I don't actually know why others don't have that. I mean, it seemed like it was kind of a requirement. It built into their requirements anyway. So, but in this one, you have the launch abort system. You have on the left-hand side here, you have the capsule, the service module, and then there's that inside of the fairing here, which really just kind of mates everything with the rocket below it. That also included small CubeSats they're going to launch, as well as that propulsion station. And then, of course, you have the rocket itself. It has 4 space shuttle engines. I mean, literally, some of them are the used space shuttle engines, and some of them are ones that were not used yet. But in any case, they're using them. Those are the 4. And then the solid rocket boosters, which also are derived from space shuttle. In that there were 4 sections in the space shuttle versions, and these have 5. They made it a little bit longer. So the mission itself, it takes a total of 42 days. What they're doing is they're going around the moon a couple of times. They'll splash down October 10th if they meet their initial date. The backup launch windows, if they miss this one, are September 2nd or September 5th. And this is actually the first flight test of SLS, the NASA rocket. And also it's the first time that it's actually been integrated with Orion. Orion has been tested way back in, I don't know, 2014 or something. Somehow or other, they got one up in the air and they dropped it down to make sure it would work. So that one actually has been tested before, but they haven't been put together. It's called Space Launch System, SLS. It will be, if they take off first here, they'll be the most powerful rocket ever in terms of thrust. They have about 8.8 million pounds of thrust. And they will hold that record until Starship actually takes off, which has about almost twice as much thrust. Just for comparison purposes, the shuttle is a little bit less. The total had about 7.8 million pounds. Apollo missions were on 7.5 million. Falcon Heavy, for comparison, is only about 5 million. Still pretty substantial and more than is needed for almost any other mission. There are very few that we've been doing so far that require this much thrust. And as I mentioned, besides taking the Orion capsule and sending that around the moon, in addition, they're also deploying some CubeSats, various kind of tests. One of them is actually a biological test. They're having some yeast, and they're going to send that off into deep space. And that means at the end of this, the propulsion stage that's pushing the last set of maneuvers on the Orion capsule, that goes off into space somewhere, and they're going to continue communicating with that, watching what's the effect of radiation on the yeast. And the effect of radiation on yeast apparently isn't that different than the effect of radiation on people. So they hope they get some good data out of that.
Are they using the B model or they're using the old model?
This is the first model. I know they have a block something, they go by block something or other, and I don't know what the next one is. But the next one,
B is bigger than the.
But that's bigger. Yeah, and that's the one that also needs a new thing to move it on the launch pad, which is mired right now because Bechtel, who's building it, ran way, way over budget. And so this is the first version of it. Yeah, the next one would be more powerful and heavier and needs a whole new thing to move it to the launch pad, which they don't have yet. There's actually a lot to these missions. You know, you take off, they're showing the path here. You start off at 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Up to this point, you have the Orion capsule and the service module. You still have that propulsion module attached. Around this point, you make some adjustments to head toward the moon, and you split out that propulsion stage. But that propulsion stage, of course, it still keeps moving. I mean, it's up there. And what it does is it actually launches some CubeSats, you know, of the 10. That's where they come. They're actually launched by this thing, which is at that point separate from Orion. And then it makes one loop around the moon and then goes shooting off into space somewhere. They'll be tracking it as they monitor that yeast experiment. The Orion capsule itself, I guess it makes a loop and then it's going to make like 3 or 4 revolutions around the moon. And then finally, it'll do some adjustments to come back. Right before they land, up at this point, that's when they split off the actual Orion capsule from the service module because there's minimal life support involved at that point. I mean, all you got to do is you take your 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it takes to get down to the surface. You can't quite hold your breath that long, but you don't need a whole lot of air. At that point, you pretty much cut off most of your life support. Then you make your splash down in the ocean. The next topic is the International Space Station, and Russia has been at it again during this last month. Actually, we thought some progress had been made, that NASA had agreements with Roscosmos, which is the Russian space agency that handles most of the civilian program anyway. Their bartering agreement is actually complete in that there is going to be one Russian cosmonaut taking off the next time that a U.S. craft goes up there. And similarly, there's going to be one American going up on one of the Russian ones. Despite all the tensions, everything that's going on right now, they did that. They can't exchange money because that's against the law, but they can barter, they can swap seats. And that's what they've been doing. And actually, both Russia and the US kind of see that to their advantage. It just helps guarantee that no matter what, there's some kind of a problem, there's always going to be some Americans and some Russians on the station at any given time. And that's really the point of that. Now, right about the same time that they announced that, the barter agreement, they finally fired this Dmitry Rogozin, who was just a loose cannon. Anybody who's been following him, he's the guy that said, well, Americans can just get up there to the space station on a trampoline, or, that kind of stuff, just totally off the wall things. But he was replaced by somebody now fairly soon named Yuri Borisov. Everybody thought, well, that's great. Now we'll finally have some sense. Well, fairly quickly, there was some kind of an interview where Borisov and Putin were in a discussion, and he promised that, oh yeah, don't worry, we're going to withdraw from the ISS after 2024. And of course, the press here all said, oh God, here we go. This is it. It's all over. And then Russia was going to work on their own station. But NASA never got any formal notification. Then people also went back and looked at the wording. And then actually Russians finally made it very clear that the wording was after 2014. So you had to parse those things kind of carefully. It was vague. And sure enough, they're saying, well, really, they're not really going to withdraw until they have their own space station, which they probably won't ever manage to actually do that. So that means that essentially, there's no real change from now. They also said that it would depend on the condition of the space station. Fine. And it might take several years to make the changeover. So net result, no real change. There's another interesting mission that's been in the works for a long time, and that's the Mars sample return. We've had the Perseverance rover up there, and it's been out there diligently collecting samples and stuffing them in little cylinders. But of course, nobody can use that. So how do you get them back so you can actually do something with them? Well, that's the Mars sample return mission, which will retrieve them. Now, and it's gotten to be fairly complicated. They've gone through several iterations. Even this year, they were talking about how many landers they were going to have, and they changed it again. And this probably will be the final thing. So what you have is, originally you're going to have 2 landers coming down. And this was the old plan. It was about an $8 billion plan, where you had one mission would send a lander with a rover on it. They call it the fetch rover. And the idea is it would go out and fetch all these various samples that have been cached all over the place, dropped off by Perseverance. Now, meanwhile, a second lander would come, and that would be one that looked pretty much like this one in the lower right-hand corner here. It would carry what's called the Mars Ascent Vehicle. That is, it's the rocket that's going to take the samples back up into Mars orbit, at least get them that far. And what that meant, though, was that there were 2 landers. So this gets to be a very, very complicated program. The reason they needed 2 landers was it was just too much weight to get down with the technology we had, like the sky cranes, or even not using the sky cranes that they used with Perseverance and Curiosity. They just said it was just too much to squeeze into one. So the first solution they came up with is we'll do 2 parallel missions. We drop them all down there. And finally, they just said, well, why don't we just forget about the fetch rover? We've got Perseverance. It can move samples around itself. So that's Perseverance right there. It's the same one we always had. Now, of course, you might ask, well, now, why didn't they think of this before? Well, these plans had been in progress for a long time. And, say 5 years ago, it wasn't obvious that these rovers like Perseverance would last this long. Well, Curiosity is going strong after 10 years, and it's pretty much the same design. And except actually it has the new design on Perseverance is much better. For instance, the wheels are a lot stronger because the wheels are falling apart on Curiosity, just 10-year-old. But, so they fixed some of those problems. And so there's a pretty good chance that Perseverance will be around. So rather than sending a rover out to a rover to fetch some samples or to a cached site, they'll just have Perseverance bring them back so it can unload its own. And then it could also then go back and probably pick up the ones. Now, how does it actually happen? It's not actually that simple because the robot arm that exists on Perseverance isn't actually capable of taking a sample and just placing it over here inside the rocket that ultimately has to carry the samples back. It's not that good. So instead, what they do, you see there's a robot arm on the lander itself. What they're going to do is Perseverance will drop off the samples that it had, either internally or the ones that's picked back up from the cached sites. They'll drop it on the ground, and then the robot arm for this other one will pick it up. So it's a little clunky, but it works, and that minimizes any danger of damaging each of those robot arms and that sort of thing. So they've solved that. Now the second thing is that, of course, nobody thought there were going to be Mars helicopters. Back in the day when they were first designing this stuff. Well, they've changed that. They've realized, hey, you can do things with helicopters on Mars. So they've redesigned, and they're going to take 2 helicopters with them also. As they're considering that the backup plan. In other words, if Perseverance is finally out of service, they don't want the whole mission to be a bust. So instead, what they'll do is then they're going to use the helicopters to carry them. And so if you look at these, they look a lot like the other one that we use right now, the Ingenuity helicopter, but except for three different things. First of all, it's a little bit bigger, so it can carry the weight. You got to carry the samples. Second thing is it has wheels. And so the idea is, even if you don't land exactly on top of the sample you're trying to pick up, you can drive over it and pick it up. And so the third thing, you probably can't see it in this picture, but it has a little tiny robot arm also. So that's why the whole thing obviously has to get bigger, because it has to be able to hold the weight of the wheels, the extra robot arm, and, well, the sample itself, so to get back and forth. But the helicopters have proven to work out so well, they figured they have to do it. And so at least they have two different ways of getting samples back and forth. So they're hopefully adding enough redundancy in this mission that if some of this stuff doesn't work, the rest of it will. Think about the entire mission. It's a fairly complicated thing. You have a mission to bring the lander. There's a separate mission that brings the orbiter. There's an orbiter, it's a Mars orbiter, whose sole purpose is to go there, keep an eye on things, and retrieve the rocket that comes back up from the surface carrying the samples. And that ends up being a fairly complicated thing. That's a two-stage rocket. When it gets up in the general vicinity of this orbiter, it then basically just shoots out like a little basketball that goes shooting, well, gets dropped there pretty much. And the orbiter then, arranges to come and pick it up. And it then kind of encapsulates it in some additional shielding and that sort of thing. And then it brings it back to Earth. When it comes back to Earth, it actually just drops it. There's no propulsion on the final Earth lander. And there's no parachutes, which is what amazed me. So they're going to drop this thing in the middle of the desert somewhere. That strikes me as a pretty hard landing, but they've worked this out. They specifically said there's no parachutes. Go figure. That's pretty much the story. Going a little further out into space, we've talked about the Lucy asteroid probe before. Now, this is the probe that's going to the so-called Trojan asteroids that are trapped at the Jupiter L4 and L5 Lagrange points. This was launched back in October of 2021. And the problem it had was it has solar arrays. You can see them, here, there's kind of an umbrella-shaped thing. And they had to unfold. I mean, obviously, to fit in the rocket, they're folded up in several different ways. But anyway, they open out, and they're supposed to simply unfurl into a complete circle. And as is suggested in this picture, one of them didn't close all the way. So they've been working at this for a while. They've tried, they have motors, of course, that pull these things together. And they tried running them in parallel for short periods of time, a spare and a backup to get extra power and everything. And they managed to get it closed a little bit more. They went from 353 degrees up to 357, out of a total possible 360. And they finally declared that to be good enough because they think there's enough tension that the whole thing is going to hold together. It matters because their first flyby, where they come by Earth again, that's a little higher stress event. So they wanted to make sure everything was going to be okay. But they decided it's good enough. They're not going to try to any further. They've tried 7 times. At some point, if it doesn't latch, it's just going to have to go as it is. And they're getting plenty of power, so it shouldn't really be a problem. Well, they just call them Trojan asteroids, but they just named them after Greeks. But they're trapped at the L4 and L5 point, the Sun, Jupiter, L4 and L5 points. So they're trapped in that general area. But that's why they wanted to visit them, because they figure, well, these things, they're kind of pristine. They've been, they haven't been banged up by a lot of other asteroids and so on. And, they probably represent pretty early what the asteroids looked like a long, long time ago. So they had a special interest. And they're going to hit a couple of random ones along the way, too. The first one will be in 2025. That one's just kind of a standalone. But it is interesting. It's a very complicated path. They don't use much fuel, but they take 3 Earth flybys to do it. Each time they come by the Earth, gravity kind of pulls them along a little bit, and helps them out. So they do that 3 times. And as I said, the first one's coming up in 2025. Okay, miscellaneous stuff. Blue Origin launched a New Shepard, the 10-minute up and down ride. They did one of those again. One kind of interesting one is that the space station has now figured out they can throw stuff directly out into space. They don't just have to fill up a Cygnus cargo craft, which is what they've been doing. Normally, the cargo craft goes up there and unloads all the cargo, and they keep it there. And then what they do is they throw all their trash and garbage in there. Cygnus is a disposable craft. And then when they have to free up port, the next thing that's coming up, they actually just basically take it. So it just goes and it vaporizes in the atmosphere as it re-enters. But what they decided is actually what they can do is in the Bishop airlock, they put the trash in there in big plastic bags. It'd be an ad for Glad trash bags or something. And in fact, that's what it looks like. If you look at the middle picture on the right here, it's wrapped up in a nice plastic bag and they shoot it off. Now, that's actually not quite as simple as it might sound. It takes the Bishop airlock to do that. You don't just drop it out because there's really nothing to push it out. So what they do, they actually remove the entire airlock on the robot arm. to carry it out. You can kind of see it, and this is the little piece of it here. This is the Bishop airlock, actually, on the end of a robot arm. The way they launch everything else is with spring. They basically just kind of nudge it out with gentle force, and that's what you end up with. And then the robot arm brings it back, and they seal it all back up. So they've made major progress. They now can throw away smaller amounts of trash on the space station. So either way, you're still going to burn up the cargo ship and you're still going to burn up the trash. So it's really just sort of a question of timing, but at least it gives them some flexibility. And it's kind of a reminder that, the space station is not terribly sustainable. They always have more than 4 astronauts, but even with 4 astronauts there, every week they basically fill up 2 trash cans. And so that's sort of a measure of what's the constant flow of material up to the space station that ultimately has to come back to Earth. And that's how bad it is. It's 2 trash cans a week. Not that different than here, actually, although presumably a little bit more efficient. Okay, the next thing, Astra, we've talked about them before. We were saying how they make about the smallest of all the commercial rockets. They can fit them in truck trailers, and they drive them up to Kodiak, Alaska when they want to launch. They have failed out of the last 7 launches. They failed 5 times. So not a very good track record at this point. NASA has gotten burned because they've lost satellites on some of these previous launches. They have a satellite called Tropic, a small constellation, 6 or 8 or something satellites, monitoring ultimately for hurricanes and that sort of thing, monitoring weather. And they still have some of those to go, and they want to get them up. So they're looking around for some other place. So, but Astra, they still have enough money left from all the money they've raised in the past, that what they said is, okay, they're going to give up on the current rocket, which only can launch like 50 kilograms to low Earth orbit. So fine, they're going to do that. They're going to make a bigger rocket, which will be able to handle 600 kilograms, which still is only the size of what the Electron rocket from Electron Lab does, and that's considered too small. None of these are even as big as a Falcon 1, which costs a whole lot less to get stuff into orbit. So you kind of have to question their business model there too. But they're going to do that. But they say, like a lot of other companies, they also have a separate business to help provide a cash flow. They make some electric thrusters, and which actually is not an uncommon strategy. Rocket Lab does the same thing. They're not actually making money yet, but what they're doing is they're making a lot more business on selling parts for satellites and other end rockets alike. They're actually, in fact, that's actually the bulk of their revenue at this point, even though they've been launching and they have a lot more launches coming up. But they've all kind of decided to diversify because the launch business is pretty tough. There's getting to be a lot of competition. It looks like, Astra will do this, but it's just hard to see that they really have a longer term future. They were kind of liked by the military because they're actually like Rocket Lab. Their story is what they call responsive launch, that when somebody decides they want to get a satellite up in a hurry, maybe because there was an accident or an attack of some sort or whatever, something gets destroyed by debris in space, they could get something up quickly. And that was kind of their strength. They could go anywhere because they could just drive it, and launch almost any orbit you wanted. So there's always going to be some market for that sort of thing. And they were hoping for that, but it doesn't look big enough to keep them along. Okay, now we're at that point of talking about how many launches have we had? And one proviso here is I missed one Russian launch last time. So it was just a couple of days before July 9th. It was back on July 7th. So in your exact count that's in your head, you have to add 1 for the right answer here. I don't know. So what do people think? How many launches have we had since the last meeting? Which was you're going back high again. Yeah, we're not there yet. Someday. There won't be any room left on Earth to walk without getting blasted by rocket exhaust. But okay. Oh, all right. Well, how many people think there were 25 or more? 1. Well, you're the one right guy. There were 25. It was a good month. So again, as usual, I will not go through all these things, but highlight a few of them. A heck of a lot of Falcon 9 launches. A lot of those are Starlink. Not all of them, but quite a few of them were. I'll highlight a couple. Vega C, which is, Europe really has a couple of lines of rockets. They have the Vega rockets, which are really basically made by the Italians, and they're the small ones. And this was a new version of theirs called Vega C. That was the first one, and it succeeded. Let's see, a whole lot of Starlink launches. The Chinese put a new science module up for their space station. Succeeded.
Managed to get a contract? Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. They actually lost. Yeah. Now it's a small one, but
considering how much grief SpaceX, Elon Musk went through, be able to bid
Yeah.
for U.S. Air Force military satellites. What was it, about 5 years ago? Back and forth. Now, that Electron quietly step in and pick up the NRO.
Yeah. Well, I think Musk broke a lot of ground there. What else you can say on that? But yeah, they're doing that. And I think there's more of those kind of things coming in the case of the Electron rocket. Although really, even they don't see much future in that size rocket. I mean, their next one up is more to compete with the Falcon 9, which is the crazy thing about this whole rocket business. Is everybody's building stuff that might, when it gets big enough, will compete with Falcon 9, which is ancient history at this point. I mean, the next generation is coming, and they're still fighting the last battle. Oh well, anyway, yeah, the Chinese, of course, have all kinds of launches. They have every kind of rocket you can imagine. Small, large. Some based on solid rockets, some based on liquid fuels. Like that, the one down here, July 27th, that was a test of a brand new one. I would say actually the science module for the Chinese space station is kind of a big deal. So, and I think they have one, maybe later this year, they might have one more module going up. Yeah, the Russians, they're still launching stuff. They put up what's called an inspector satellite. Well, it's suspected. And what that means is that basically it's really there to watch other satellites, for military purposes. And it was immediately obvious because it went into essentially the same orbit as an existing U.S. satellite that had just gone up. It was kind of a new generation, and nobody quite knew what that was going to do. So, of course, they want to go up there and take a good close look at it. And, of course, also implicitly threaten that, by the way, they could just come and crash into you or something if they really wanted to. So that kind of thing goes on all the time. Anyway, that's what that one was all about. Let's see. Yeah, the NRO mentioned here, they've done a mission with using the Electron. Yeah. So I said they're definitely doing this. Now, the Chinese, they had this launch on here. It's about on August 4th. Most people think it's a reusable space plane, a lot like the USX-37, which looks like a small version of the space shuttle. And this would be the second flight of that one. And this is all. No one's really gotten a real good picture of this, but that's what it looks like. Let's see, Galactic Energy in China. That's a new one. Well, South Korea didn't launch it. South Korea, they sent a mission to the moon. So the moon, actually, I didn't even mention that before when we were talking about the moon, but yeah. They're putting up the first lunar orbiter. It'll be entering lunar orbit in December. No, it's not landing. It's just doing an orbit. But they have plans to, ultimately land on the moon again, too. So this is South Korea, not North Korea. Yeah.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, and they went on a Falcon 9, and we're showing that again, even the existing medium weight class rockets can get small payloads there. Now, this is another one that went up using one of these orbits. It takes a long time to get there, but very low energy. It's not it's the kind of thing it takes months to get there, but you're not usually in a hurry on these things. So that's the same thing with the the Electron mission that we talked about last month, where they launched this thing also for the, basically to test out the halo orbit that'll be used by the Gateway. They launched a very small satellite, and it's the same kind of a deal. They went on a path that takes very little energy. And even a rocket as small as the Electron can actually get you into lunar orbit. Okay, yeah, the Russians launched an Iranian satellite.
That's a lie. It's not Iranian satellite.
It isn't an Iranian satellite? I thought it was.
Built and studied, built and launched in Russia. It has nothing with Iran.
Well, okay. But but they're selling spying as a service, I guess, if you will. I mean, yeah, you're right. The Russians actually built the thing, and that's why they can say, people claim that actually what's going to happen is that initially they're going to use it mainly to watch what's going on in Ukraine. It's sort of sad in a way from Russia's standpoint that they have to resort to that sort of thing. But it is a service ultimately for the Iranians. So, they do want to have satellites up there. And yeah, maybe they didn't actually build it. I didn't realize they didn't build it, but it wouldn't.
They just paid for that.
Yeah. So there you have it.
SSL, India's small satellite launch vehicle.
That failed. Yeah, But that was a new launch vehicle. There's so much ferment. There's companies coming and going trying to build stuff. In this case, this is India. It's state sponsored. They are still. There aren't that many sources of for heavier lifts. There aren't that many places you can go to get rockets anymore, and people are turning to India. This is a small one. That's a new one. But for their larger polar vehicles, they've been selling them to some extent. Okay, and then the last one of those launches I'll just highlight here was the last of the Starlink launches. They have now put up 3,055 satellites. That's how many have been launched since the start of this program. Now, they're not all operational. Some of those have already been deorbited. About 2,600 of them are operational, and there's probably another 100 that are in the process of going from their initial orbit up to the final orbit. So not really in service yet. They have very definite shells that they try to get set up into, so they have a nice predictable path. And they don't launch them to that right away. They launch them lower, and then with their they have Hall thrusters, ion thrusters, which will then take them up a little bit higher. So there's always 100 now, 100 or so in process of doing that. Yeah.
There was a ticking clock aspect to the Starlink satellite system, as I remember. The commercial satellite arm of the government basically gave them a certain time frame. And I was thinking that it was basically, it must have been right at the end of June, I thought, but end of the second quarter. But I guess this means then that they let it run out 6 weeks longer, but that this means that Starlink and SpaceX, did they meet the government requirement? They had to have a functioning system in place by such and such date. Remember,
they must have. They typically have those criteria, and I haven't heard anything about anyone thinking that's a problem. That has been a problem for, I guess, for OneWeb, which is struggling, especially since they were all depending on Soyuz rockets to get them up there. That's actually a bigger issue for them. I haven't heard any real concerns lately about the SpaceX ones. Now, on the other hand, the system still isn't considered good enough. They had bid on getting a bunch of funding for supporting rural access to broadband, and they didn't. That may have been political. It may not have been. You'll never know those kind of things. But they were hoping to get like some fairly large amount of money, in subsidies, and they ended up not getting that. That was announced in this last month also. Okay, I guess that's it. Any other comments or questions, insults, whatever.